Maggie Ashford stood before the Reverend Morton with her hands clenched at her sides, refusing to bow her head as he delivered yet another lecture about the proper comportment expected of unmarried women in Chisholm Ranch, New Mexico Territory, this spring of 1878. The small parlor of the boarding house felt stifling, made worse by the presence of 3 town matrons who had appointed themselves guardians of everyone's morality, their eyes boring into her with disapproval that she had learned to wear like armor. "Miss Ashford, you simply cannot continue running your late father's freight business," Reverend Morton said, his tone dripping with false concern. "It is unseemly for a woman of 22 to be handling contracts with ranchers, driving wagons, and managing accounts. You need a husband to take over these responsibilities. Thomas Brennan has made his interest quite clear, and he comes from good stock." Maggie lifted her chin, meeting the Reverend's gaze without flinching. "Thomas Brennan wants my business, not me. The moment we married, everything my father built would become his property, and I would become nothing more than a decoration in his home. I respectfully decline." Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, gasped as though Maggie had uttered a profanity. "Young lady, you speak of marriage as though it were some sort of business transaction. A woman's place is to support her husband, not to be gallivanting around the territory with freight wagons like some common laborer." "My father left me his business because he trusted me to run it," Maggie replied, keeping her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her skin. "I have honored every contract, paid every debt, and my customers are satisfied. I fail to see how any of this concerns anyone but myself." Reverend Morton sighed heavily, exchanging meaningful glances with the assembled matrons. "This is precisely the problem, Miss Ashford. You have become too independent, too set in your ways. No decent man wants a wife who challenges him at every turn, who insists on handling matters that are rightfully in the masculine domain. Your independence is not a virtue. It is a flaw that will leave you alone and unmarried." The words stung more than Maggie wanted to admit, but she refused to let them see her falter. "Then I suppose I shall remain alone. Good day, Reverend." She swept out of the boarding house parlor before anyone could respond, her boots clicking sharply against the wooden planks of the porch. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street, and Maggie paused to take a steadying breath before descending the steps. 3 proposals in the last year, and each man had made it abundantly clear that what they wanted was not a partner, but an obedient wife who would quietly surrender everything she had worked for. Chisholm Ranch sprawled along the Pecos River, a rough collection of buildings that had grown from a cattle ranch into a small settlement. The actual Chisholm operation dominated the landscape, but the town itself consisted of a general store, saloon, blacksmith, boarding house, small church, and scattered residences. Maggie's freight office occupied a modest building near the edge of town, close enough to the main road for convenience, but far enough from the respectable establishments to avoid constant scrutiny. She walked briskly toward her office, nodding to familiar faces but not stopping to chat. The weight of the Reverend's words pressed down on her shoulders, and she needed the solitude of her workspace to shake off the encounter. Her father, Samuel Ashford, had died 18 months ago from pneumonia, leaving her not only grief-stricken but facing a world that believed she had no right to inherit his life's work. The freight office was a simple structure with a covered porch, a main room for conducting business, and a storage area in the back. Maggie unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scents of leather, paper, and the faint aroma of coffee from this morning's pot. Her father's desk, now hers, sat positioned to face the door, its surface organized with ledgers, correspondence, and maps of various routes through the territory. She had just settled into the chair when the door opened again, and her assistant, young Peter Collins, stuck his head inside. The 18-year-old had been working for her since shortly after her father's death, proving himself capable and loyal despite his relative inexperience. "Miss Ashford, there is a gentleman here to see you about a freight contract. Says his name is Grant Anderson." Maggie straightened, pushing aside her troubled thoughts. Business was business, and she needed to stay focused. "Show him in, Peter." The man who entered the office a moment later was not what Maggie expected. Most ranchers and businessmen who sought her services were middle-aged or older, set in their ways and often skeptical of dealing with a woman. Grant Anderson could not have been more than 26 or 27, tall and lean with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: dark trousers, a faded blue shirt, worn leather vest, and a hat that he removed upon entering, revealing brown hair that needed a trim and gray eyes that assessed her with frank curiosity rather than dismissal. "Miss Ashford?" he asked, his voice a low drawl that carried the accent of someone who had spent time in Texas. "Mr. Anderson, please have a seat." Maggie gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting the confident way he moved, the calluses on his hands when he set his hat on his knee. This was a man who knew hard work intimately. "I appreciate you seeing me without an appointment," Grant began, settling into the chair with an ease that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. "I am new to the area, just purchased some land about 15 miles north of here. I am planning to start a horse ranch, breeding and training quality mounts for ranchers and the Army. I need someone reliable to freight in supplies and eventually help me transport horses to buyers in other territories." Maggie pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, her pen poised. "What volume of freight are we discussing, and what is your timeline?" For the next 20 minutes, they discussed the specifics of his needs. Grant proved to be well prepared, with detailed lists and realistic expectations. Unlike many men who patronized her, or tried to negotiate terms as though she did not understand basic arithmetic, Grant treated her as an equal professional, asking intelligent questions and listening carefully to her answers. "Your rates are fair," he said finally, reviewing the figures she had written down. "But I have to admit I am surprised. When folks in town directed me to Ashford Freight, I expected to be dealing with a man." Maggie felt her shoulders tense, preparing for the inevitable objections. "My father built this business, and I inherited it upon his death. I assure you, Mr. Anderson, I am every bit as capable of fulfilling contracts as he was." Grant held up a hand, something that might have been amusement flickering in his eyes. "I am not doubting your capabilities, Miss Ashford. Just noting my surprise. Truth be told, I am more interested in competence than convention. If you can deliver what you promise, I do not care if you are a woman, a man, or a trained bear." Despite herself, Maggie felt a smile tug at her lips. "I can assure you I am neither a man nor a trained bear." "Good to know," Grant replied, and this time he definitely was almost smiling. "I have seen what trained bears can do, and it is generally destructive." The tension in Maggie's shoulders eased slightly. "I can deliver what I promise, Mr. Anderson. I have been running this business for 18 months now, and I have yet to default on a contract. Then we have a deal." Grant extended his hand across the desk. Maggie shook it, noting the firm grip and the rough texture of genuine work-worn skin. "I will draw up the contract and have it ready for your signature tomorrow. When do you need your first delivery?" "As soon as possible. I am living in temporary quarters right now, but I have lumber and materials being shipped by rail to Roswell." If you could pick them up and freight them to my property, I can start building proper structures." They discussed a few more details before Grant rose to leave. At the door, he paused, turning back to face her. "Miss Ashford, I could not help but notice you seemed troubled when I first arrived. I hope I have not added to your concerns." The observation surprised her. Most people were too wrapped up in their own affairs to notice the emotional states of others, particularly when it came to business dealings. "Not at all, Mr. Anderson. You have actually been a bright spot in an otherwise difficult day." Grant nodded slowly, studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. Small towns can be suffocating, especially for people who do not fit neatly into expected roles. "I imagine you face considerable pressure." "That is an understatement," Maggie admitted, then wondered why she was being so candid with a virtual stranger. "For what it is worth, I think anyone who has the courage to buck convention and forge their own path deserves respect, not censure." He settled his hat back on his head, touching the brim in a casual salute. "I look forward to doing business with you, Miss Ashford. Good afternoon." He was gone before Maggie could formulate a response, leaving her staring at the closed door with a strange warmth spreading through her chest. In a single conversation, Grant Anderson had shown her more respect and understanding than most people in Chisholm Ranch had offered in 18 months. Peter poked his head back into the office. "Did you get the contract?" "Yes," Maggie replied, shaking off her momentary distraction. "We leave for Roswell the day after tomorrow. Make sure the large wagon is in good repair and we have adequate supplies for the journey." The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Maggie finalized the contract with Grant, who signed it without quibbling over a single term, then prepared for the trip to Roswell. The journey would take 2 days each direction, longer if they encountered difficulties, and she needed to ensure everything was in order before departing. True to his word, Grant had arranged for the materials to be ready for pickup, providing detailed documentation that would make the railway transfer smooth. Maggie found herself impressed by his organizational skills and attention to detail, qualities that suggested he would be a good client for the long term. The morning they departed, Maggie and Peter loaded the wagon before dawn, hitching up a sturdy team of 4 mules. The air still held a hint of coolness that would burn off within hours, and the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of sunrise. Maggie wore her practical traveling clothes, split skirt that allowed her to sit astride if necessary, sturdy boots, a loose cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat to shade her face from the brutal sun. "You sure you do not want me to drive?" Peter asked for the 3rd time, hovering near the wagon seat. "I am sure," Maggie replied, swinging herself up with practiced ease. "You know I prefer to handle the reins myself on long hauls. You can spell me later if I get tired." They set out as the sun crested the horizon, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as they followed the well-worn road east toward Roswell. The landscape stretched out in all directions, a vista of rolling plains interrupted by distant mountains, the vegetation sparse but tenacious. Maggie loved this country despite its harshness, loved the way the sky seemed to go on forever, and the sense of space that made even her problems feel smaller. The first day passed without incident. They made good time, stopping periodically to rest the mules and eat their packed provisions. As evening approached, they made camp near a creek that provided water for the animals and a pleasant spot to spend the night. Peter gathered wood for a fire while Maggie tended to the mules, checking their hooves and making sure they were properly secured for the night. "Miss Ashford," Peter said as they sat by the fire eating beans and hardtack, "why do you think Mr. Anderson did not have any problem with you being a woman?" Maggie considered the question, watching the flames dance in the gathering darkness. I think he cares more about results than appearances. Some people are like that, more interested in what you can do than what society says you should be. He seems like a decent fellow, Peter observed. Not like that Thomas Brennan who keeps hanging around the office making a nuisance of himself. Maggie sighed, thinking of the persistent suitor who refused to accept her rejections gracefully. Thomas sees me as a means to an end. He wants to expand his own freight business, and acquiring mine through marriage would be cheaper than competing with me. That is a terrible reason to marry someone, Peter said with the blunt honesty of youth. Most marriages have little to do with affection, Maggie replied, hearing the cynicism in her own voice. Especially among people with property or business interests. But I would rather remain unmarried than enter into a union that amounts to nothing more than a business acquisition. They reached Roswell late the following afternoon, a town considerably larger than Chisholm Ranch, with a bustling main street and multiple businesses catering to the surrounding ranches and travelers. Maggie navigated directly to the railway depot, where Grant's shipment was waiting as promised. The loading took several hours, with railway workers helping to transfer lumber, bags of nails, tools, window frames, and various other building supplies onto her wagon. Everything was carefully secured to prevent shifting during the return journey, and Maggie inspected each load personally, making sure the weight was properly distributed. They spent the night at a modest hotel, a rare luxury that Maggie allowed herself on long hauls, then set out before dawn for the return trip. The loaded wagon moved more slowly than they had on the outbound journey, requiring more frequent stops to rest the mules, but they made steady progress. They were perhaps 10 miles from Chisholm Ranch when Maggie spotted riders approaching from the west. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured beside the wagon seat, but she relaxed slightly when she recognized Grant Anderson's tall frame and distinctive way of sitting a horse. Grant was accompanied by 2 other men, both cowboys by their appearance, and they pulled up alongside the wagon with friendly waves. "Miss Ashford," Grant called out, "I was hoping to intercept you before you reached my property. I wanted to make sure you had proper directions, and I thought an escort might be welcome for the final stretch." "That is thoughtful of you, Mr. Anderson," Maggie replied, genuinely appreciative. While she could handle herself in most situations, having armed riders along reduced the risk of trouble from bandits or hostile individuals. Grant gestured to his companions. "This is Jake Morris and Sam Turner, 2 of the hands I have hired. They will be helping with the construction." The men tipped their hats respectfully, and Maggie noticed that neither showed any particular surprise or disdain at dealing with a female freighter. Grant's acceptance seemed to extend to his employees, or perhaps he had simply hired men who shared his practical outlook. "Follow me," Grant said, wheeling his horse around. "My land is just north of here. The road gets a bit rough, but the wagon should manage." He was right about the road. What had been a relatively smooth track deteriorated into little more than a pair of ruts winding through increasingly rocky terrain. Maggie handled the mules with practiced skill, guiding them around the worst obstacles and maintaining a steady pace despite the challenges. Grant's property proved to be a beautiful piece of land, with a creek running through it and several natural corrals formed by rock outcroppings. A temporary camp had been set up near the creek, consisting of a few tents and a cooking area. The site chosen for the main house offered a commanding view of the surrounding landscape while providing natural wind protection from a rocky ridge. "This is perfect for horses," Maggie observed as she brought the wagon to a halt near the construction site. "Plenty of water, natural shelter, and good grazing." Grant's face lit up with obvious pride. That is exactly what I thought. I have been searching for the right property for almost a year. When this became available, I knew it was meant to be. They spent the next hour unloading the supplies, with everyone pitching in to move the heavy materials. Maggie insisted on helping despite Grant's protests, unwilling to stand by while others did physical labor on her behalf. By the time everything was stacked and organized, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "You should stay for supper," Grant said as Maggie prepared to depart. "It is getting late and you have already worked hard today. Sam is a decent cook, and we have plenty of food." Maggie hesitated, aware that accepting such an invitation might be seen as improper by the town gossips. But she was tired, hungry, and the prospect of Grant's company was surprisingly appealing. "I would be grateful for a meal, thank you." Peter looked relieved at not having to make camp and cook after the long day, and he quickly made himself useful helping Sam prepare the evening meal. Maggie found herself sitting on a log near the fire with Grant, watching the flames while the sky turned spectacular shades of orange and purple. "How did you end up in the freight business?" Grant asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than making conversation. Maggie wrapped her hands around the tin cup of coffee he had given her, gathering her thoughts. "My father started the business when I was a child. My mother died when I was young, so I spent most of my time with him, learning the routes, how to handle animals, how to read contracts and keep accounts. By the time I was 16, I was essentially running things alongside him. When he died, continuing the business was the only way I knew to honor his memory. And the town does not approve. It was a statement, not a question." Maggie looked up to find Grant watching her with an expression of understanding that loosened something tight in her chest. "They think I should marry and let my husband take over, that I am being stubborn and unfeminine by insisting on maintaining control." "You are not being stubborn," Grant said quietly. "You are protecting what is yours, what you built with your own hands and knowledge. There is nothing wrong with that. Most men would disagree with you. Most men are fools." Grant said it so matter-of-factly that Maggie found herself laughing, a genuine sound that felt foreign after weeks of tension and criticism. "What brought you to New Mexico territory?" she asked, wanting to shift the focus away from her own troubles. Grant was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I spent years working for other people's ranches, learning everything I could about horses and land management. I saved every penny, lived rough, and kept my eye on the goal of owning my own place. Texas has gotten too crowded, too many ranchers competing for the same resources. The territory offers opportunities for someone willing to work hard and think strategically about the future." "You talk about horses the way some men talk about gold strikes," Maggie observed. "Horses are more reliable than gold," Grant replied with a slight smile. "And there is always going to be a demand for quality mounts. The Army needs them, ranchers need them, and anyone traveling this country needs them. If I can establish a reputation for breeding and training exceptional horses, I will never want for business." They talked until full darkness fell, and Sam called them to supper. The meal was simple but satisfying. Beans and salt pork with fresh bread Sam had somehow managed to bake in a Dutch oven. The conversation flowed easily among the small group, with Jake and Sam proving to be good-natured men who treated both Maggie and Peter with easy respect. As they prepared to leave, Grant walked Maggie back to her wagon, carrying a lantern to light the way. "Thank you for the excellent service, Miss Ashford. Everything arrived in perfect condition. I am glad I could meet your needs, Mr. Anderson. If you require anything else, you know where to find me." Grant paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Would you be amenable to me calling on you sometime, not for business purposes but socially?" Maggie's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Mr. Anderson, I should warn you that any man seen courting me becomes the subject of considerable town gossip. My reputation as an unsuitable woman is well established." "Maggie," Grant said, and the use of her given name sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "I did not come to New Mexico territory to live my life according to other people's narrow expectations. I find you fascinating, intelligent, and remarkably capable. If you would allow me to get to know you better, I would consider it a privilege. The town gossips can say what they like. She should refuse. Getting involved with a client with any man would only complicate her already difficult situation." But standing in the lantern light with Grant looking at her like she was someone worth knowing, Maggie found herself nodding. "I would like that." The smile that spread across Grant's face was worth every bit of potential trouble. "Then I will call on you in a few days, once I have made some progress on the house. Perhaps you would allow me to take you to dinner. Chisholm Ranch does not have much in the way of fine dining establishments," Maggie warned. "Then we will make do with what is available. The company matters more than the venue." They said their goodbyes, and Maggie climbed onto the wagon seat feeling lighter than she had in months. Peter, wise beyond his years, said nothing about the exchange he had undoubtedly witnessed, simply settling in for the journey back to town. The next few days fell into a familiar rhythm of work and routine. Maggie had other contracts to fulfill, deliveries to make, and the endless paperwork that came with running a business. But underlying everything was a quiet anticipation, a awareness that something in her life had shifted. True to his word, Grant appeared at her office 4 days later, cleaned up and wearing what were obviously his best clothes, a pressed shirt and trousers that had seen better days but were meticulously maintained. Maggie had taken extra care with her own appearance, wearing one of her few dresses, a simple blue cotton that her father had always said brought out her eyes. The town took notice immediately. Maggie could feel eyes watching as she and Grant walked together down the main street toward the saloon, which served meals in its back room during the early evening before the drinking and gambling began in earnest. Whispers followed in their wake, but Grant seemed utterly unconcerned, his attention focused on her. "You look beautiful," he said as he held the door open for her, the words simple but sincere. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." They were shown to a small table in the back room, relatively private despite the handful of other diners. The menu was limited, but the food was decent, and Maggie found herself relaxing as they talked. Grant had an easy way about him, asking questions and listening to her answers with genuine interest, sharing stories from his own life that ranged from humorous to harrowing. "So you actually rode with a cattle drive from Texas to Kansas?" Maggie asked, fascinated by his description of the months-long journey. "3 of them," Grant confirmed. "Learned more about horses and men in those drives than I could have in a lifetime of ordinary work. It is brutal, dirty, dangerous work, but there is something about being out there under the stars with nothing but cattle and sky for miles that strips away all the pretense. You learn what a man is really made of. Is that where you learn to be so unconcerned about convention?" Grant considered the question thoughtfully. "Partly, but mostly I learned from watching people build their lives around other people's expectations and end up miserable. My own father was like that, spent his whole life trying to live up to some ideal his family had set for him, and he died unhappy and full of regrets. I decided early on that I would forge my own path, even if it meant going against the grain." "That takes courage," Maggie said softly. "So does what you are doing," Grant replied, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. Running a business in a world that tells you at every turn that you have no right to do so, facing down criticism and rejection, refusing to compromise your independence for the sake of conformity. That is true courage, Maggie. She felt tears prick her eyes at the validation, the simple acknowledgement that what she was doing mattered and was worthy of respect. Sometimes I wonder if I am just being stubborn, if I should just find a decent man and settle into the role everyone expects. Do you want that? No, Maggie admitted. I want to build something of my own to prove that my father's faith in me was not misplaced. I want to succeed on my own terms. Then that is what you should do. Grant squeezed her hand gently. And for what it is worth, I think you are succeeding remarkably well. They lingered over the meal longer than strictly necessary, reluctant to end the evening. When they finally emerged back onto the street, full darkness had fallen, and the saloon was beginning to fill with its nighttime clientele. Grant walked Maggie back to the boarding house where she rented a room, their pace deliberately slow. "I would like to see you again," Grant said as they paused at the porch steps. "I would like that too," Maggie replied, very aware of how close he was standing, how the lantern light caught the planes of his face. "I will be in town next week for supplies. Perhaps another dinner. Or you could come by the office. I usually have coffee ready in the afternoons and the conversation is free." Grant smiled, that warm expression that made her pulse quicken. "That sounds perfect. Until then, Miss Ashford." He touched the brim of his hat in that casual salute she was coming to recognize as characteristic, then turned and walked away into the darkness. Maggie stood on the porch for a long moment, watching until he disappeared from sight, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. The next morning brought reality crashing back. Maggie had barely opened the office when Thomas Brennan strode through the door without knocking, his face flushed with anger. "What do you think you are doing, parading around town with that drifter?" he demanded, slamming his hands down on her desk. Maggie rose slowly, keeping her expression neutral despite the fury rising in her throat. "My personal life is none of your concern, Mr. Brennan." "Everything about you is my concern," Thomas shot back. "I have made my intentions clear, offered you a respectable marriage, and this is how you repay my patience. By making a spectacle of yourself with some nobody who just showed up with nothing but a patch of rock and weeds. Your intentions, as you call them, have been rejected multiple times," Maggie said, her voice cold. "I am not interested in marrying you, and I resent your implication that I owe you anything, including an explanation of who I choose to spend time with." Thomas's face darkened further. "You think you are so smart, so independent, but you are just a foolish woman who does not know what is good for her. Anderson will use you for what he needs and move on, leaving you even more unmarriageable than you already are." "Get out of my office," Maggie said quietly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You are making a mistake that you will regret," Thomas warned, jabbing a finger at her. "I am a respected businessman in this town and I have connections. If you continue to refuse me while entertaining that cowboy, you will find your business opportunities drying up very quickly. Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan? I am promising you." With that, Thomas turned on his heel and stalked out, leaving the door swinging open behind him. Maggie sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly shaky. She had known Thomas was persistent and entitled, but she had not anticipated outright threats. The problem was, he probably could make good on them. He did have connections with many of the local ranchers, and if he spread rumors or cast doubt on her reliability, it could seriously damage her business. Peter, who had witnessed the entire exchange from his corner desk, looked worried. "Miss Ashford, what are you going to do?" "The same thing I have been doing," Maggie replied, forcing strength into her voice. My job. I will not be intimidated into making life decisions based on threats. But over the following week, Thomas's influence became apparent. 2 regular clients sent messages canceling upcoming contracts, citing vague reasons that did not hold up under scrutiny. Another client who had been negotiating a substantial freight agreement suddenly stopped responding to Maggie's correspondence. The financial impact was not yet devastating, but the trend was deeply concerning. Grant appeared at her office 3 days later, as promised, and Maggie found herself pouring out the whole story over coffee. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This Thomas Brennan is trying to force your hand through economic coercion," Grant said when she finished. "That is despicable." "That is business," Maggie replied bitterly. "Or at least, that is what he would claim. He has every right to encourage people to use his freight company instead of mine, but not by spreading lies or using intimidation tactics." Grant set down his coffee cup, leaning forward with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Maggie, I may be new here, but I am not without resources. Let me help." "How? You are just getting your own operation started. You cannot afford to make enemies in the community." "I can afford to stand up for what is right," Grant said firmly, "and I will not stand by while someone tries to destroy you for refusing to surrender your independence." That is exactly the kind of injustice that makes me furious. Despite her worry, Maggie felt warmth spread through her chest. "What did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, they formulated a plan. Grant would leverage his own growing network of contacts, particularly among the smaller ranchers and settlers who might be less influenced by Thomas Brennan's connections. Maggie would focus on maintaining her existing relationships and continuing to provide excellent service that would speak for itself. Together, they would weather the storm. What Maggie had not anticipated was how quickly word would spread that Grant was actively supporting her. Within days, she received an inquiry from a rancher Grant had befriended, followed by another from a settler who needed supplies freighted from Roswell. The work was not as lucrative as some of the contracts she had lost, but it was steady, and it demonstrated that she was not as isolated as Thomas had hoped to make her. Grant's support extended beyond mere business networking. He began appearing at her office regularly, sometimes to discuss his own freight needs as his construction progressed, but often simply to share a meal or conversation. His presence became a fixture that the town could not ignore, and his obvious respect for Maggie's capabilities challenged the narrative that she was an unmarriageable oddity. They were having lunch at her desk one afternoon, eating sandwiches Peter had fetched from the general store, when Grant said something that made Maggie's heart skip. "I have been thinking about the future," he began, setting down his sandwich with unusual deliberation. "About what I want my ranch to become, the kind of life I want to build, and I realize that what I envisioned is incomplete." Maggie set down her own food, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to say. "Incomplete how?" Grant met her eyes, his expression serious but warm. "I always pictured building something substantial, creating a legacy. But I pictured doing it alone, being self-sufficient and independent. What I have come to understand, particularly since meeting you, is that independence does not have to mean isolation. That the strongest partnerships are between two people who are both capable of standing alone but choose to stand together." "Grant," Maggie whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "I am not proposing," he said quickly, though his mouth quirked in a slight smile. "Not yet, anyway. We have only known each other a few weeks. But I want you to know that when I look at your independence, your determination, your refusal to compromise your principles, I do not see flaws. I see exactly the qualities I would want in a partner. I see someone I could build a life with, not by diminishing either of us, but by combining our strengths." Tears stung Maggie's eyes, but these were not tears of frustration or hurt. "Everyone else sees my independence as something that needs to be fixed or suppressed." "Everyone else is wrong," Grant said simply. He reached across the desk, taking both her hands in his. "You are remarkable exactly as you are, Maggie, and if you will let me, I would like to keep getting to know you to see where this connection between us might lead." "I would like that very much," Maggie managed, her voice thick with emotion. They were interrupted by the office door opening, and both turned to see Reverend Morton enter, his expression even more disapproving than usual. "Miss Ashford, I need to speak with you privately." Grant rose but made no move to leave. "With respect, Reverend, if this concerns Miss Ashford's personal conduct, I believe I should stay." The Reverend's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Young man, I do not know what your intentions are, but I came to warn Miss Ashford that her behavior is becoming increasingly scandalous. The town is talking about how much time she spends with you, and people are beginning to question her morals." "Her morals?" Grant's voice dropped dangerously low. "We have shared meals and conversation in public places. If the town finds that scandalous, the problem lies with the town's imagination, not with Miss Ashford's behavior." "You do not understand the expectations of a respectable community," Reverend Morton insisted. "A woman in Miss Ashford's position must be above reproach." "A woman in Miss Ashford's position is working twice as hard as any man in this town and receiving half the respect," Grant countered. "She is running a successful business, honoring every contract and conducting herself with complete propriety. If the town cannot see that, then frankly, the town is not worth her concern." Maggie had been watching this exchange with growing amazement. No one had ever defended her so fiercely, so publicly. "Reverend," she said, finding her voice, "I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Anderson is right. I have done nothing improper. If people choose to gossip, that reflects their character, not mine." The Reverend looked between them, his expression suggesting he was dealing with two particularly obstinate children. "You are both being foolish. Miss Ashford, you could still salvage your reputation by accepting Thomas Brennan's proposal. Mr. Anderson, you should be seeking a wife who will properly support your ambitions, not a woman who insists on maintaining her own separate business." "With all due respect, Reverend," Grant said, his tone making it clear that very little respect was actually being offered. "My ambitions include finding a partner who challenges me, who has her own skills and capabilities, who will not simply defer to me in all things." "Miss Ashford embodies everything I could want." The Reverend opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head in defeat. "You are both determined to follow this path despite all wise counsel. Very well, but do not come to me when this ends in scandal and ruin." He swept out of the office with an air of wounded dignity, leaving Maggie and Grant staring at each other. After a moment, Maggie began to laugh, a sound that started as a chuckle and built into genuine mirth. "I cannot believe you just did that," she gasped between laughs. Grant was grinning now, the tension leaving his shoulders. "I have never had much patience for people who think they have the right to dictate how others should live. You just made yourself very unpopular with one of the town's moral authorities. I will survive." Grant settled back into his chair, picking up his sandwich. "Besides, I meant every word. You are exactly what I need, Maggie. Your independence is not a flaw to be overlooked, it is a strength to be celebrated." Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and evolved. Grant made progress on his house, and Maggie continued to handle freight contracts, their lives beginning to interweave in ways both practical and profound. Grant would often appear at her office at the end of a workday, and they would ride out to his property together, with Maggie offering advice on the construction and Grant sharing his plans for the horse breeding program. She met his small but growing crew of workers, men who treated her with the same easy respect Grant demonstrated. She learned about bloodlines and training techniques, discovering a genuine interest in the work Grant was doing. He, in turn, took an interest in the logistics of her freight business, asking thoughtful questions and occasionally offering suggestions that revealed a keen business mind. It was during one of these visits to his ranch, nearly 2 months after they had first met, that things shifted between them. They were standing on the partially completed porch of his house, watching the sun set over the landscape, when Grant turned to her with an expression of such tenderness that her breath caught. "I love you, Maggie," he said quietly. "I know it has not been that long, but I am certain. You are everything I did not know I was searching for." Maggie felt tears well up, but these were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home. "I love you too, Grant. You make me feel like I can be completely myself without apology." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "You never have to apologize for who you are, not to me or anyone else." When he kissed her, it felt like a promise, like the beginning of something profound. Maggie wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the emotion she had been holding in check for weeks. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the feel of his lips on hers, the strength of his arms around her, the absolute rightness of being in this moment. They broke apart eventually, breathless and smiling. Grant rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face. "Marry me, Maggie. Not because anyone expects it, not because of propriety or business, but because I cannot imagine building my life without you in it." "Yes," Maggie whispered, the word coming easily, feeling right in a way nothing else ever had. "Yes, I will marry you." Grant kissed her again, deeper this time, and Maggie felt like her heart might burst from happiness. When they finally separated, both were grinning like fools. "I do not have a ring yet," Grant admitted. "I was planning to wait until the house was finished, do this properly." "I do not need a ring," Maggie assured him. "I need you, and I need us to be partners in every sense of the word." "We will be," Grant promised. "I want you to keep your business, Maggie. I do not want you to give up what you have built. We will find a way to make both our enterprises work together." "You do not want me to just become your wife, running your household," Grant laughed softly. "I want you to be my wife, absolutely. But I also want you to be Maggie Ashford, the freight company owner who is smarter and more capable than half the businessmen in the territory. I want all of you, not just the parts that fit conventional expectations." They talked late into the evening, sitting on the porch as stars emerged overhead, planning their future. It would not be easy. Combining their lives and businesses would require careful coordination and compromises from both of them. But the foundation they were building was solid, based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and a shared vision of partnership rather than ownership. The announcement of their engagement caused exactly the stir Maggie had anticipated. The town was divided in its response. Some people were scandalized, convinced that Maggie had somehow trapped Grant into marriage. Others were cautiously pleased, seeing it as evidence that Maggie might finally settle into a more appropriate role. A small but vocal minority, primarily consisting of people who knew one or both of them well, expressed genuine happiness at the match. Thomas Brennan's response was predictably hostile. He confronted Grant one afternoon in front of the general store, his face flushed with anger and perhaps alcohol. "You are a fool," Thomas snarled, jabbing a finger at Grant's chest. "That woman will never be a proper wife. She is too stubborn, too independent, too set in her ways. You will regret this." Grant did not back down, his expression calm but his eyes hard. "The only thing I regret is that Maggie had to deal with your harassment for so long. She is worth 10 of you, Brennan, and if you ever threaten her or her business again, you will answer to me." "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise." Grant stepped closer, and despite Thomas being slightly larger, something in Grant's demeanor made the other man step back. "Maggie is going to be my wife, and I protect what is mine. Leave her alone." Thomas glared at both of them, but apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. He turned and stormed away, muttering under his breath. Several townspeople who had witnessed the exchange looked at Grant with new respect, recognizing a man who would stand his ground. Maggie, who had watched the confrontation from her office doorway, felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her bristled at Grant's possessive language, the implication that she needed male protection. But a larger part recognized that he was standing up for her in a way that the community would understand and respect, lending his masculine authority to reinforce her right to independence. When Grant joined her at the office afterward, she voiced her concerns. "I do not want you to feel like you have to fight my battles." "I do not think you need me to fight your battles," Grant replied, taking her hands. "You are more than capable of standing up for yourself. But we are going to be partners. Maggie and partners support each other. If someone threatens you, they are threatening our future together, and I will not stand for that. As long as you understand that partnership goes both ways. If someone threatens you or your business, I will stand beside you just as fiercely." Grant smiled, raising her hands to his lips. "I would expect nothing less." They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church with a handful of close friends in attendance. Maggie wore a new dress, pale green calico that she had purchased for the occasion, and carried wildflowers that Grant had picked that morning. Grant wore his best clothes, which still bore the marks of a working man's life, and looked at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. Reverend Morton performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his disapproval clear even as he spoke the traditional words. But Maggie barely noticed, too focused on Grant's face, on the promises they were making to each other. When the Reverend finally pronounced them married, Grant kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes well up with happy tears. The wedding celebration was modest, held at Grant's ranch since the house was now complete. His crew had helped prepare food and set up tables, creating a festive atmosphere despite the small guest list. Peter was there, beaming with pride as though he had personally arranged the match. Jake and Sam toasted the couple with genuine warmth. A few of Maggie's other clients who had remained loyal despite Thomas's campaign attended, their presence a statement of support. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Maggie and Grant found themselves alone on the porch of their new home. The word sent a thrill through her. Their home, a place they would build together, create a life together. "Happy?" Grant asked, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "Incredibly," Maggie replied, leaning into his warmth. "Though I admit I am a bit nervous about managing both the business and being a wife." "We will figure it out together," Grant assured her. "I am thinking we should keep your office in town but perhaps consolidate some operations here. That way you can manage contracts and logistics from the ranch while Peter handles the day-to-day operations in town." They had discussed this plan over the past weeks, working out the details of how to maintain her business independence while building their shared life. It would not be perfect, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but the foundation was solid. That night, in the bedroom Grant had built with his own hands, they came together with a passion and tenderness that left them both breathless. Maggie had worried that the intimacy might be awkward or uncomfortable, but Grant was patient and attentive, making sure she felt cherished and safe. When they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, sated and happy, Maggie felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too," Grant replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "My fierce, independent, remarkable wife." The first months of marriage brought both joys and challenges. Maggie worked to balance her business responsibilities with her new domestic life, sometimes struggling to find the right equilibrium. Grant proved to be a true partner, taking on his share of household tasks and never making her feel guilty for the time she spent on her freight company. They established a routine that worked for both of them. Maggie spent 3 days a week in town at her office, managing contracts and coordinating deliveries. Peter had proven himself more than capable of handling the daily operations, freeing Maggie to focus on strategy and client relationships. The remaining days she worked from the ranch, handling correspondence and accounts while also helping Grant with his growing horse operation. The horse breeding program was beginning to show real promise. Grant had acquired several excellent mares and a spectacular stallion, and the first foals born under his management showed the quality he had been aiming for. Word of his skill as a trainer spread, and he began receiving inquiries from ranchers across the territory. One evening about 4 months into their marriage, Maggie was working on accounts at the kitchen table when Grant came in from the corrals, his face alight with excitement. "I just got word from Fort Stanton," he announced, barely containing his enthusiasm. "They want to purchase 20 horses for the cavalry, with potential for ongoing contracts if the quality meets their standards. This could establish us with a stable, high-volume customer." Maggie jumped up, throwing her arms around him. "Grant, that is incredible. That is exactly the kind of contract you have been working toward." He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing. When he set her down, his expression turned serious. "I could not have gotten here without you, Maggie. Your business advice, your support, your belief in what I was building. You have been essential to this success." "We are partners," Maggie said, echoing the words they had spoken so often. "Your success is my success, and mine is yours." Over the following year, both their businesses flourished. Grant's reputation as a horse breeder and trainer grew, bringing in clients from across New Mexico and even neighboring territories. Maggie's freight company not only recovered from Thomas Brennan's attempts at sabotage, but expanded, with her reputation for reliability and fair dealing attracting new customers. Thomas himself had largely disappeared from their lives. His own freight business had begun to struggle, whether due to karma or his own poor management was unclear. He eventually left Chisholm Ranch, moving to a different town where his reputation had not yet caught up with him. The community's attitude toward Maggie and Grant gradually shifted. While there would always be people who disapproved of their unconventional arrangement, many came to respect what they had built together. Maggie's success challenged assumptions about what women could achieve, while Grant's obvious happiness and prosperity demonstrated that supporting a wife's independence did not diminish a man's standing. It was nearly 2 years into their marriage when Maggie realized she was pregnant. She had been feeling tired and slightly queasy for several weeks before the truth became undeniable. The realization filled her with a complex mix of emotions. Joy at the prospect of creating a family with Grant, but also fear about what pregnancy and motherhood might mean for her business and independence. She told Grant one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Grant went very still, his eyes searching hers. "A baby? We are going to be parents?" "Yes. "Are you happy?" In answer, Grant pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Happy does not even begin to cover it, Maggie. I am overjoyed, terrified, excited, and completely overwhelmed." She laughed against his chest, relief flooding through her. "That is exactly how I feel. But Grant, I need you to understand that I still want to work to maintain my business. I know it will be more difficult with a child, but I cannot just give everything up." Grant pulled back slightly to look at her face. "Maggie, I have never asked you to give up your work, and I am not starting now. We will figure out how to balance parenthood with our businesses. Plenty of women have managed both, and you are more resourceful than most. We will make it work." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Maggie's initial worries. She continued to work through the first months, only gradually reducing her schedule as her body grew heavier and more cumbersome. Peter stepped up magnificently, taking on additional responsibilities and proving that her trust in him had been well placed. Grant was attentive without being smothering, supporting her when she needed it, but allowing her the independence she craved. Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1880, after a labor that was mercifully brief for a first child. Grant held her hand through the entire ordeal, his face pale but determined. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Maggie's arms, Grant's expression transformed into something akin to awe. "He is perfect," Grant whispered, carefully touching the baby's tiny fist. "He is loud," Maggie observed, exhausted but elated as their son continued to voice his displeasure at being thrust into the world. They named him Samuel Grant Anderson, after Maggie's father and his father. Little Sam proved to be a healthy, demanding infant who kept both parents exhausted and besotted in equal measure. Maggie had worried that she would resent the time motherhood took from her work, but instead, she found herself constantly amazed by this tiny person they had created. The logistics of managing a newborn while running a business proved challenging, but not impossible. Maggie set up a cradle in her office for the days she worked in town, and the ranch hands quickly became accustomed to the presence of a baby in their midst. Jake and Sam, Grant's loyal employees, proved surprisingly adept at entertaining the infant when both parents were occupied. As Sam grew from infant to toddler, he displayed early signs of inheriting both parents' stubborn independence. He walked early, constantly escaping his designated safe areas to explore everything within reach. By his second birthday, he was already fascinated by both horses and wagons, clearly absorbing his parents' passions through osmosis. "We have created a tiny tornado," Grant observed one afternoon, watching as Sam attempted to climb into a wagon wheel while Maggie tried to extract him. "He is curious," Maggie defended, though she was laughing as she pulled their protesting son away from the wheel. "He is trouble," Grant countered, but his tone was affectionate. Just like his mother. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before Sam's arrival, but rich with meaning. The ranch expanded, with Grant adding more corrals and outbuildings to accommodate his growing herd. Maggie's freight business continued to thrive, with Peter eventually becoming a full partner in the enterprise. The arrangement allowed Maggie to focus more on strategic planning and major contracts, while Peter handled daily operations. Financial security brought new opportunities. They invested in improvements to the ranch house, adding rooms and amenities that made their home more comfortable. They purchased additional land, expanding their grazing areas and increasing the ranch's productivity. Most importantly, they created a life that reflected their shared values of independence, partnership, and mutual respect. When Sam was 3, Maggie found herself pregnant again. This time, the realization brought less fear and more excitement. as she knew from experience that she could balance motherhood with her other responsibilities. Their daughter, Emily Sarah Anderson, was born in the spring of 1884, a quieter baby than her brother but with an observant intensity that suggested a keen intelligence. The arrival of a daughter brought new considerations. Maggie was determined that Emily would grow up seeing women as capable and independent, with options beyond conventional domesticity. Grant fully supported this vision, delighted at the prospect of raising a daughter who would be as fierce and capable as her mother. As the children grew, the ranch became a lively place filled with laughter and activity. Sam, now 5, was already learning to ride and showing a natural affinity for horses that delighted Grant. Emily, still a toddler, seemed to have inherited her mother's head for numbers and logistics, capable of amazing feats of memory for one so young. The years passed in a blur of work, family, and the endless small joys of daily life. Maggie watched as her business evolved, eventually training Emily to handle accounts as she herself had learned from her father. Sam became Grant's shadow, absorbing everything his father knew about horses and land management. The community that had once viewed Maggie with suspicion and disapproval gradually came to accept and even celebrate her unconventional life. Young women in Chisholm Ranch and surrounding areas began to see her as proof that they could forge their own paths, that marriage and motherhood did not have to mean surrendering independence. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grant arranged for the children to stay with Jake and Sam for the evening, giving him and Maggie a rare night alone. They sat on their porch as they had so many times before, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. "You ever regret it?" Grant asked, taking her hand. "Choosing this life with me, taking on all the challenges and criticism." Maggie turned to look at her husband, seeing the gray beginning to thread through his brown hair, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, the calluses on his hands from a lifetime of hard work. She saw the man who had looked at her independence and seen strength instead of flaw, who had stood beside her through every challenge, who had helped her build a life beyond her wildest dreams. "Never," she said simply. "You saw me exactly as I was and said that is exactly what I need. You gave me partnership instead of ownership, respect instead of control. How could I ever regret that?" Grant smiled, that warm expression she had fallen in love with years ago. "I am the one who got the better deal. You made me better, Maggie. You challenged me, supported me, and showed me what a real partnership could be." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something lasting and true. The children eventually grew into young adults. Sam took over increasing responsibility for the horse operation, bringing his own innovations while respecting the foundation his father had built. Emily surprised everyone by developing a passion for freight logistics that rivaled her mother's, eventually taking over full management of Ashford Freight with Peter's blessing as he moved toward retirement. Maggie and Grant gradually stepped back from daily operations, transitioning into advisory roles while their children took the reins. It was a strange adjustment after decades of constant work, but also freeing. They traveled together for the first time, visiting cities and landscapes they had only heard about. They spent time with their growing number of grandchildren, watching a new generation learn the values of independence, hard work, and partnership. One evening in their later years, sitting on the same porch where so much of their life had unfolded, Grant turned to Maggie with a thoughtful expression. "You remember what that reverend said when we got engaged, that we were being foolish, that we would end up scandalized and ruined." Maggie laughed, the sound still bright despite her age. I remember he was wrong about almost everything. Not almost, completely. Grant squeezed her hand gently. We built something remarkable, Maggie. 2 successful businesses, a beautiful family, a life that mattered. And we did it by rejecting all the conventional wisdom about how things should be. You gave me permission to be myself, Maggie said softly. In a world that told me I needed to change, you said that who I was, my independence and stubbornness and ambition, was exactly what you needed. That changed everything. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to emerge overhead. 2 people who had found each other in the vast wilderness of the New Mexico territory and created something that would outlast them both. Their children carried on their businesses with skill and dedication. Their grandchildren were learning the same values of independence and partnership. The legacy they had built was not just financial or professional, but philosophical, a living demonstration that love and respect could create something far stronger than control and convention ever could. The ranch continued to thrive under Sam's management. The horses bred their known throughout the territory and beyond for their quality. Emily expanded Ashford Freight, eventually establishing routes that connected New Mexico to markets across the West. Both businesses bore the marks of their founders' values, treating employees fairly, dealing honestly with customers, and maintaining the highest standards of quality. In the town of Chisholm Ranch itself, Maggie and Grant had become something of local legends. The story of the independent freight company owner who refused to compromise her principles, and the cowboy who recognized her independence as strength rather than flaw, was told and retold. Young couples cited them as proof that marriage could be a true partnership. Women pointed to Maggie as evidence that they did not have to choose between love and autonomy. As Maggie and Grant entered their twilight years, they found themselves surrounded by the fruits of their unconventional choices. Sunday dinners brought the whole family together, the ranch house filled with the sounds of children and grandchildren, conversation and laughter. Sam and his wife managed the horse operation with skill that would have made Grant proud in his younger days. Emily and her husband ran the freight company while raising their own brood of independent-minded children. One particularly memorable Sunday, as 3 generations gathered around the extended dining table, young Matthew, Sam's eldest son at 15, asked a question that brought the conversation to a halt. "Grandmother, is it true that people used to think you should not run a business because you were a woman?" Maggie glanced at Grant, seeing the amusement in his eyes before answering. "It is true. When your great-grandfather died and left me his freight company, many people believed I should marry and let my husband take over. They thought a woman could not handle such responsibilities." "That is stupid," Matthew declared with the absolute certainty of youth. "Many conventions are," Grant interjected, "when you examine them closely. The important thing is to think for yourself and have the courage to follow your own path, even when others disapprove." Emily smiled at her father. "That is what you and Mother taught us. To value competence over convention, to judge people by their capabilities rather than their circumstances, and to recognize that the strongest partnerships are between equals," Sam added, raising his glass in a toast. "To Mother and Father, who showed us what that looks like." Everyone raised their glasses, and Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. This was what they had built. Not just businesses or property, but a family that understood and embodied the values they held dear. A legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Later that evening, after the family had dispersed and quiet had returned to the ranch, Maggie and Grant sat together on the porch swing Grant had built years ago. The night was clear, stars brilliant against the dark sky, the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night surrounding them. "I have been thinking," Grant said, his arm around Maggie's shoulders, "about the day we met. You came to my ranch to deliver those building supplies, and I knew within minutes that you were someone special. You saw past the fact that I was a woman doing a man's job," Maggie replied, leaning into his warmth. "No," Grant corrected gently. "I saw a competent professional doing their job well. Your gender was irrelevant to your capabilities. That is what so many people could not understand. They were so focused on what you were that they could not see who you were. And you saw who I was. I saw someone fierce and capable and refusing to be diminished by others' limited expectations. I saw exactly the kind of partner I wanted for building a life." Grant kissed the top of her head. "And I have never, not for one single day, regretted that decision." Maggie turned to look up at her husband, seeing the love and respect that still shone in his eyes after all these years. "We did well, did we not? Not just in business, but in life. We did better than well. We created something remarkable." Grant gestured toward the ranch spread out before them, the barns and corrals, the fields and fences, all of it built through their combined efforts. "This is all because two stubborn people refused to let the world tell them how they should live." They sat in companionable silence, the swing moving gently, years of shared history flowing between them without need for words. Maggie thought about the young woman she had been, standing in that boarding house parlor being lectured about her unmarriageable independence. If she could speak to that younger self, what would she say? That independence was not a flaw to be ashamed of, but a strength to be celebrated. That the right partner would see her autonomy as an asset rather than a threat. That love and respect could build something far more enduring than control and submission ever could. That choosing her own path, however difficult, would lead to a life of meaning and fulfillment beyond anything convention could offer. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring brought new foals, their wobbly legs and curious natures a perpetual source of delight. Summer meant long days of work under the relentless sun, but also the satisfaction of seeing both businesses thrive. Autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, a time of harvest and preparation. Winter brought a slower pace, time for rest and reflection, for family gathered around the fire sharing stories. Maggie and Grant grew older together, their hair silvering, their bodies wearing the marks of decades of hard work. But their partnership remained strong, their love deepening with each passing year. They had built their life on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values, and that foundation proved unshakable. When Peter Collins, Maggie's longtime assistant and eventual business partner, passed away at the age of 70, the funeral brought together people from across the territory. Peter had never married, devoting his life to the freight business and to supporting Maggie's vision. In his will, he left his share of the company to Emily, along with a letter expressing his gratitude for the opportunity Maggie had given a young man with no prospects. Emily read the letter aloud at the family dinner following the funeral, her voice breaking at certain passages. Peter had written about how working for Maggie had taught him that worth was determined by character and capability, not by birth or circumstance. That seeing a woman succeed in a male-dominated field had expanded his own understanding of what was possible. That he hoped he had honored Maggie's trust by helping build something lasting. "He understood what we were trying to do," Maggie said softly when Emily finished reading. "He understood that it was not just about running a business, but about challenging assumptions and expanding possibilities for everyone." Grant took her hand, his grip still strong despite his years. "You changed lives, Maggie. Not just our family's lives, but Peter's and countless others who saw what you accomplished and realized they could forge their own paths. As the years advanced, Maggie and Grant gradually withdrew from public life, content to spend their days on the ranch they had built together. Their children and grandchildren visited frequently, bringing news of the businesses and the wider world. The freight company continued to expand under Emily's management, now operating routes throughout the Southwest. The horse ranch maintained its reputation for quality, with buyers traveling from distant states to purchase Sam's carefully bred and trained animals. On a warm spring afternoon in their 73rd year of life, Grant and Maggie sat together on their porch, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. 3 generations had grown up on this land, each carrying forward the values their grandparents had embodied. "Do you remember Thomas Brennan?" Grant asked suddenly, the question seemingly random. Maggie had to think for a moment, the name from so long ago. "The man who tried to force me into marriage through economic coercion. Yes, I remember. Why?" "I heard he died recently, alone and bitter, his business having failed years ago. I found myself feeling sorry for him." Grant watched the children playing, his expression thoughtful. He could not see past his own limited understanding of how the world should work. He missed out on everything that makes life worthwhile because he was so focused on control and convention. "He represents the old way," Maggie observed. "The belief that power comes from domination rather than partnership, that worth is determined by conformity rather than capability. We chose a different path, and what a path it has been." Grant turned to smile at her, the expression still capable of making her heart flutter after all these years. "Every single day I thank whatever force brought you into my life. You made everything possible, Maggie. You showed me what real strength looks like." Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beating of his heart. "We showed each other. That is what partnership means, Grant. We made each other better, stronger, more capable than we could have been alone." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Maggie reflected on the life they had built. It had not been easy. They had faced criticism, economic challenges, the endless difficulties of balancing multiple responsibilities. But they had faced everything together, as true partners, and in doing so had created something remarkable. Their love story was not one of rescuing or being rescued, of one person completing another's deficiencies. It was a story of 2 complete individuals choosing to build something together, combining their strengths while respecting each other's independence. It was a story of seeing a quality the world called a flaw and recognizing it as a strength. It was a story of refusing to compromise core values for the sake of convention. The ranch would continue after they were gone, run by descendants who had learned the lessons they taught. The freight company would keep operating, connecting communities and facilitating commerce across the growing nation. But more important than any business or property was the legacy of their partnership itself, the living proof that love and respect could create something enduring and true. As darkness fell and stars emerged one by one, Grant and Maggie remained on their porch, comfortable in the silence of deep companionship. They had said everything that needed saying over the course of their long life together. Now it was enough just to be present with each other, 2 souls who had found their perfect match against all odds. The children eventually called them inside for supper, and they rose together, moving with the careful deliberation of age but still hand in hand, as they had been for over 5 decades. Inside, the house was warm and bright, filled with the voices of family, the legacy of their unconventional choices made manifest in the lives of those who came after. That night, lying in the bed they had shared for so many years, Maggie whispered into the darkness. "Grant, are you still awake?" "Always for you," he replied, his voice soft but clear. "I love you. I wanted to make sure I said it today." "I love you too, Maggie, more than words can express." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms. Two people who had defied convention to create something beautiful and lasting. Their story would be told for generations, not as a fairy tale of rescue and transformation, but as the truth of what partnership could be when built on respect, equality, and genuine love. The morning sun rose over the ranch, illuminating the land they had built together, the legacy they would leave behind, and the enduring truth that sometimes the qualities the world calls flaws are actually the greatest strengths of all. Maggie Ashford had been rejected for being too independent, until a cowboy named Grant Anderson said that was exactly what he needed. Together, they had proved that real love does not diminish independence but celebrates it, that true partnership makes both people stronger, and that the courage to forge your own path can lead to a life beyond imagining. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the lessons they had taught, creating their own unconventional paths, building their own partnerships based on mutual respect and shared values. The businesses they had founded continued to thrive, but more importantly, the philosophy they had embodied that worth comes from capability rather than conformity, that independence is strength rather than flaw, continued to inspire new generations to think differently about what was possible. In the end, Maggie and Grant's story was not just about two people falling in love. It was about two people choosing to build a life that honored their authentic selves, refusing to compromise their values for the sake of acceptance, and in doing so, creating something that would outlast them both. It was about looking at what the world called impossible and saying, "Watch us prove you wrong." It was about the power of partnership, the strength of independence, and the enduring truth that sometimes the person who says you are exactly what I need is the one who changes everything.